A wad of spit landed square across a young man's cheek. It hung there for a second, then slid down toward his jaw. He didn't wipe it. He didn't flinch. Across from him stood a huge man, 280 pounds, thick neck, shaved head, huge scarred fists. 10,000 people were screaming. Some laughed, some booed. A small dog barked once from the front row, then went quiet. The young man raised one open hand, slow, asking the crowd for calm. The noise dropped a little. He did not shout. He did not swing in anger. He looked up at the giant and said something the back rows could not hear. The giant grinned and stepped forward. That young man was Bruce Lee. What he did in the next 9 seconds in front of that jeering crowd, no one there ever forgot. Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand those 9 seconds, you have to back up a few days, because this didn't come out of nowhere. This had been building all week. It was 1964 in Oakland, California. There was an old boxing arena on the east side of the bay, a big brick building that used to host prize fights back before the war. A promoter had rented it out for a martial arts exhibition. Demonstrations, weapons forms, breaking boards, that kind of thing. It was supposed to be a showcase, a way to bring the crowds in and sell tickets, and it worked. By the final night, 10,000 people had packed into that place. Bruce Lee was 23 years old, skinny, 135 pounds maybe. He ran a small school across town where he taught his own style, his own ideas about fighting, and he taught anyone who showed up serious and willing to work. That last part mattered, because back then there were men in the martial arts world who believed certain arts should stay with certain people, that you didn't teach outsiders. Bruce didn't care about any of that. He taught a mailman, a college kid, a retired boxer, a young woman who worked at a diner. He taught whoever wanted to learn. And that made him enemies. Now here's the thing about Bruce. He wasn't there to fight anybody. He was there to demonstrate a philosophy. His whole idea was that speed and timing beat size and muscle, that a smaller man who moved right could handle a bigger man who just swung hard. He believed control was strength, that the man who stayed calm won. He'd spent years building this. It wasn't talk to him, it was his life. He used to tell his students that any fool can throw a punch. The hard part, he'd say, is not throwing one when everything in you wants to. He brought his students with him that week. And he brought his dog, a little terrier named Bao, a scruffy brown thing that followed him everywhere. One of his students, a kid named Danny, held the leash down in the front row every night. Bao would sit there quiet, watching Bruce on the mat like he understood every word. Bruce loved that dog. When he wanted the room to settle, he'd sometimes look down at Bao first, like the dog reminded him to breathe. Then there was Duke Halloran. Duke was a local, a brawler. He'd done some boxing, some wrestling on the carnival circuit, bare-knuckle stuff in back rooms for money. 280 pounds and mean with it. He wasn't part of the exhibition. He was hired muscle, sort of, brought in by some men who ran betting out of the arena. They liked having him around. He was loud, he drew a reaction, and the crowd fed on him. He had a way of finding the one man in a room who wouldn't fight back and making that man his entertainment for the night. And from the first night, Duke had picked out Bruce. He'd stand near the mat while Bruce demonstrated, and he'd talk, loud enough for whole sections to hear. He'd mock Bruce's size. He'd mock where he came from. He'd say things about his eyes, his height, his accent, ugly things. The kind of things I'm not going to repeat here word for word, but you know exactly what kind of man says them. He'd hold up his own thick arm next to a photo in the program and get the crowd laughing. He turned Bruce into the joke of the whole event. By the third night, whole sections of the arena were chanting along with him. That's how it works with a crowd. One loud man gives them permission and the cruelty spreads like it costs nothing. Bruce ignored him every night. He'd finish his demonstration, bow, gather his students, and leave. He never took the bait. His students wanted him to answer it, Danny especially. Danny was young and hot, and he hated watching his teacher get spat on with words in front of thousands of people. One night Danny actually started up out of his seat, fists ready, and Bruce caught his sleeve without even turning his head. Bruce would put a hand on his shoulder and say, "An angry man has already lost. Just wait." And Danny would sit back down, shaking, and Bruce would go right on with the lesson like nothing had happened. But there was more to it than pride. And this is where the stakes come in. The men who ran that arena, the ones who hired Duke, they didn't like Bruce's school. They didn't like that he taught outsiders. Some of them had money in the old traditional schools across the bay, and Bruce was bad for business. So all week, it wasn't just Duke's mouth. There was pressure, quiet threats. A man came to Bruce's school and suggested he close it. Suggested Oakland wasn't a good place for him to keep teaching. Suggested things could get difficult. He didn't raise his voice. Men like that never do. He just left an envelope of money on the table, and when Bruce didn't touch it, he smiled and said Bruce would come around, one way or another, and walked out. Bruce left the envelope sitting right where it was for 3 days, so every student who came in would see he hadn't taken it. So by the last night, Bruce knew this wasn't only about a loudmouth. This was a test. If he let Duke run him off that mat, humiliated, he wasn't just losing face. He was proving them right. He was handing them the excuse to shut him down and drive him out. And 10,000 people had bought tickets partly to see it come to a head. The promoter knew it too. He'd been building it all week, letting Duke run his mouth, letting the tension climb because tension sells. That last night the place was electric before Bruce even stepped out. People were chanting Duke's name. They wanted a moment. They wanted the little instructor and the giant to finally stand face to face. They didn't come for board breaking anymore. They came for blood. Bruce felt all of it when he walked to the mat. He told me once, years later in an interview, that he could feel a crowd like weather. And that night the weather was ugly. He said you could taste it, that a crowd wanting to see a man broken has its own smell to it, and he'd walked into a room full of it. But he walked out anyway. Calm. Bao barked once from the front row. Bruce raised his hand for quiet, and he began. He started the way he always did, simple movements. He talked as he moved, explaining his idea that a punch you can see coming is a punch you can beat. He asked for a volunteer from among the other demonstrators, a strong young man, and he let that man try to hit him. The man threw a punch. Bruce wasn't there. The man threw again. Bruce had already touched him twice on the chest, tap, tap, before the punch landed on air. The man tried a third time, faster, really meaning it now, and Bruce swayed back an inch and let the fist go by and touched him on the forehead, soft, like a joke. The crowd, for a second, forgot they hated him. They gasped. A few clapped. That was the wrong thing to happen. Because up near the ropes, Duke Halloran didn't like being upstaged. Not one bit. He'd spent all week being the star, the one the crowd watched. And now this skinny kid was pulling the room away from him with nothing but his feet and his open hands. So Duke stepped over the rope and walked onto the mat. The promoter didn't stop him. That tells you something. Nobody stopped him. 10,000 people saw the giant walk out under the lights toward the small man, and the noise came up like a wave. This was the moment they'd waited for. Bruce turned and saw him coming. He didn't back up. He lowered his hands and stood easy, and he waited, the way you wait for whether you already knew was coming. Duke walked right up into his face. Close. Looking down at him from a full head taller and 145 pounds heavier, he said something. The front rows heard it. It was the kind of thing that makes a room go quiet even when the room is full of people who came to jeer. He said Bruce didn't belong here. He said it with the ugly word attached, the one he'd been using all week, and he said it slow so it would carry all the way to the back. Bruce looked up at him and didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just held the man's eyes and stood there, and I think that stillness bothered Duke more than any answer could have. And that's when Duke spat in his face. You already know it happened because I opened with it. But sitting there in that arena, seeing it live, it was worse than any word. 10,000 people saw a man spit in another man's face. Some of them roared, some of them laughed, and some of them, believe me, went dead silent because there's a line, and even a crowd that came for blood knows when a man has crossed it. Bruce didn't move. The spit slid down his cheek. Danny was on his feet in the front row, the leash tight in his fist, Bao barking now, and Bruce raised one hand toward his student without even looking, just held it up. Stay. And Danny stayed, but you could see it was costing him everything he had. Then Bruce did the last thing anyone expected. He reached up slow, and he wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. He looked at his hand. Then he looked up at Duke, and he spoke, quiet, just loud enough for the man to hear. He said, "I am not going to hit you." Duke laughed. Bruce said it again, "I am not going to hit you." Then he said, "But I don't think you can touch me, not once. Try. Reach out right now and touch me." And he put his hands behind his back. The crowd went insane. This little man, spat on, humiliated, had just put his hands behind his back and dared the giant to touch him. It was either the bravest thing they'd ever seen or the dumbest, and nobody knew which, and that not knowing is exactly what kept every single one of them in their seat. Duke grinned and reached out one huge hand for Bruce's collar, and missed. I mean, he missed by a foot. Bruce hadn't seemed to move fast. He just wasn't where the hand went. Duke's fingers closed on air. The crowd made a sound like the air got let out of the building. Duke's face changed. He grabbed again, both hands this time, a lunge. Bruce leaned back at the waist just enough, and the hands passed over him, and he was standing straight again before Duke even finished the reach. Twice now. Twice the giant had grabbed at a man standing right in front of him, hands behind his back, and caught nothing. You could see the confusion start to work its way across Duke's face, the first crack in all that certainty. And then, just as fast as it had flared, the whole thing seemed to end, because the promoter had finally come running out. He got between them. He grabbed Duke's arm and pulled him back, waving his other hand at the crowd, playing it up, calling it an exhibition, saying, "Let's keep it friendly, folks." Two arena men climbed up onto the mat. Duke let himself be walked back a few steps, breathing hard, still glaring but backing off. The moment cooled. Bruce brought his hands out from behind his back and let them drop. He gave a small bow, more to the crowd than to Duke, and turned away. It looked finished. He walked to the edge of the mat. Danny handed him a towel and a cup of water. Bruce wiped his face properly now, took a sip, and knelt down. Bao came off the leash and pressed against his knee, tail going, and Bruce put a hand on the dog's head and just breathed. He'd done it. He'd stood his ground, made his point, and he hadn't thrown a single punch in anger. The crowd was settling. It was over, except it wasn't over. Because Duke Halloran had not come out there to look foolish. And a man like that, humiliated in front of 10,000 people, does not walk away. He waits until your back is turned. Bruce was still kneeling with his dog when he heard the crowd's sound change. It didn't rise like a cheer. It cracked, sharp, the way a crowd cracks when they see something the man on the mat can't. Danny's eyes went wide over Bruce's shoulder. And Bao, that little terrier, spun around and started barking like the world was ending. Bruce moved before he understood why. Duke had torn loose from the arena men and crossed the mat in 3 steps, and he was already swinging, a right hand thrown with all 280 pounds behind it, aimed at the back of Bruce's head while he knelt. This was not an exhibition anymore. This was a man trying to end another man from behind in front of a paying crowd, with everyone watching and nobody quick enough to stop it. And here's what changed, and I need you to catch this because it's the whole turn of the story. Up to that second, it had been about pride, about mockery and face and who got the last laugh. Now it was about survival. A punch like that, landed clean on the back of a kneeling man's skull, doesn't hurt him. It can kill him. Duke wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. He was trying to put Bruce Lee in the ground. Bruce dropped and rolled off his knee, and the fist tore through the space where his head had been. He came up on the far side of his dog, on his feet now, hands open, and for the first time all week his face had changed. Not angry, something colder than angry. He'd offered peace. He'd put his hands behind his back. He'd bowed and walked away. And the man had tried to kill him from behind while he knelt with his dog. The two arena men grabbed Duke again. And now Duke shook them off like coats and shoved one of them flat on the mat. The promoter was yelling. It was chaos. The crowd was on its feet, all 10,000, a roar you could feel in your chest. And in the middle of all that noise, Bruce stepped forward. Not back, forward. And he said, loud enough now that the front rows heard every word, all right. You want to touch me? Come touch me. If you've made it this far with me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the next part is exactly why I wanted to tell you this story in the first place. What Bruce Lee did in the following seconds is the whole reason people still talk about that night. All right, back to the mat. Now, before I tell you what happened, understand the corner Bruce was in, because it was worse than just a big man wanting to hurt him. Remember the men who ran the arena, the ones who wanted his school closed. In that second, with Duke loose and swinging, Bruce had a choice, and both roads looked like they went off a cliff. If he beat Duke down, hurt him bad, in front of 10,000 people, those men had exactly what they wanted. Local instructor cripples a hometown fighter. They'd have the police, the papers, the excuse. They'd shut his school. They'd run him out of Oakland, maybe out of California. Everything he'd built gone. All they needed was for Bruce to look like the animal Duke had spent all week calling him. But if he didn't fight, Duke would hurt him. Maybe worse. This wasn't a sparring giant anymore. This was a man trying to kill him. So Bruce had to do something almost impossible. He had to stop a 280-pound man from killing him in front of 10,000 people without ever looking like the aggressor. He had to win and stay clean. He had to beat this man and have the whole crowd, even the ones who hated him, know that he never once struck in anger. That's a razor's edge. That's a thing most fighters can't do because they can't keep their temper when a man tries to take their head off. Most men in that spot would have swung back with everything, and nobody would have blamed them. But everybody would have remembered it, and the wrong people would have used it. And this is where all those years of discipline, all that talk about control being the real strength, stopped being talk. This was the test he'd been training his whole life for and never knew it. Duke came at him. A wild right, then a left, big looping punches, the kind that end fights when they land. Bruce didn't block them. He slipped them. He moved his head an inch, 2 inches, no more than he had to, and let the giant's fists rip through empty air. And with every miss, Duke got angrier, and angrier means slower, and Bruce knew it. He was reading the man like a book he'd already finished. He kept his own hands low, open. He would not close a fist, not yet. He wanted every single person in that arena to see that the little instructor was not throwing punches. He was only refusing to be hit. And you could feel the crowd starting to understand it too, section by section, the laughter dying, replaced by something quieter and more amazed. Duke charged, arms wide, trying to grab him, crush him, use his weight. Bruce dropped a shoulder, turned, and let the big man's own momentum carry him stumbling past into the ropes. The crowd laughed, and that laugh, aimed at Duke now, drove the man past reason. He turned and came again, screaming, and this time he threw everything he had, a haymaker that would have taken Bruce's head off. Bruce ducked under it, and as it sailed over him for the first time, he tapped Duke. Not a punch. Just a flat, open hand tap against the man's ribs as he went by. A tap that said, I could have. I chose not to. The crowd saw it. They understood it. 10,000 people, and I'd bet half of them felt the ground move under this story right then, felt it change from a beating into something else. The small man was schooling the giant, and he wasn't even hitting him. But taps don't stop a 280-pound man. Duke was hurt in his pride, not his body, and a man like that just keeps coming until something makes him stop. Bruce knew that too. He knew this couldn't go on. Every extra second gave the giant one more chance to land the one punch that ended everything. Slipping punches forever is a way to lose slowly. He needed to finish it, cleanly, once. He told his students 100 times that mercy is not the same as hesitation. You end the thing and then you show mercy. You don't drag it out and call that kindness. So Bruce stopped moving. He planted his feet in the center of the mat, and he brought his hands back behind him one more time, and he looked up at Duke Halloran and he said it again, the same words as before, but quiet now, almost gentle. Touch me. The whole arena went still. You could hear it drop, 10,000 people holding one breath. Even Bao stopped barking. Duke stood there, chest heaving, sweat pouring off him, staring at this little man who just made him miss a dozen times and was now standing wide open with his hands behind his back, daring him again. Duke roared and threw the hardest, straightest punch he had left, right down the middle, right at Bruce's face, everything he owned behind it. Here it is. The 9 seconds, count them with me. Bruce turned his head. The fist went past his ear. That's 1. His hands came out from behind his back, and his left hand caught Duke's punching arm at the wrist and pulled, just a little, just enough to keep the big man leaning forward off balance. 2, 3. Bruce stepped in close, inside the giant's reach, chest almost against him, a place a big man's power can't reach. 4. He set his right hand flat against Duke's chest, palm open, fingers spread, no wind-up, no cocking back, the hand just resting there. 5. And then he did the thing he was famous for, the thing people had come from all over to see and never believed was real. He drove that hand forward maybe 3 inches. 6. That's all. 3 inches of movement from a hand already touching the man's chest. But behind those 3 inches was every ounce of Bruce Lee, from his heel to his hip to his shoulder to his palm, all of it snapping through at once in a single line. 7. Duke Halloran left his feet. 280 pounds went up and back like he'd been hit by a car. 8. He crashed down onto the mat flat on his back, and the whole arena floor shook and the air went out of him in one great gasp everybody heard. 9. 9 seconds. From the moment Duke threw that last punch to the moment his back hit the mat. 9 seconds and the giant was down and Bruce Lee was standing over him with his hands still open, breathing slow, not a mark on him. The arena exploded, but not the way it had before. This was different. This was 10,000 people who had come to watch a small man get humiliated, standing up all at once, roaring for him. The same crowd that had laughed when he was spat on was now on its feet screaming his name. Because there's nothing on earth a crowd loves more than watching the thing they were sure was impossible happen right in front of them. And Duke didn't get up. He rolled to his side, gasping, one arm across his chest, and he tried to push himself up and couldn't. That one open-handed strike, 3 inches, had knocked the wind and the fight and the meanness clean out of him. He got to his knees, and he stayed there on his knees on the mat in front of 10,000 people, looking up at the man he'd spat on. This is the part I really want you to sit with, because here's where you find out who Bruce Lee actually was. He could have finished it. The crowd would have loved it. Duke was helpless on his knees, and every person in that building would have cheered if Bruce had stood over him and made him pay for the whole ugly week. That's what Duke would have done. That's what the men who ran the arena expected, because that's the story they needed, the animal finishing his kill. Bruce didn't. He stepped back. He brought his hands together and lowered them. And then he did something that made the roar in that arena die down into a strange, held quiet, because nobody could quite believe it. He reached down, and he offered Duke Halloran his hand. The giant knelt there staring at the hand of the man he had spat on and tried to kill from behind. And after a long moment in front of everybody, Duke Halloran took it. and Bruce Lee helped him up off the mat. Then Bruce leaned in and said something to him, quiet just between them, that the crowd couldn't hear. Danny told the story for years after. He said Bruce told the big man just one thing. He said, "Now you know, that's all. Now you know." And that was the end of it. Bruce turned, walked to the edge of the mat and knelt down, and Bao came off the leash and jumped into his arms, licking his face where the spit had been, and Bruce laughed, this young man, 23 years old, laughing with his dog while 10,000 people chanted for him. He picked up the towel. He picked up the cup of water. He drank it slow. He had done exactly what he set out to do. He'd made his point. Speed beats size. Control beats rage. The calm man wins. And he'd made it not with a speech, but with 3 inches of open hand, and then he'd made a second point, a bigger one, by helping his enemy up off the floor. Now here's what happened after, because a story like this has a tail and it matters. Those men who ran the arena, the ones who wanted Bruce gone, they didn't get their story. They'd wanted the vicious outsider, the excuse to shut his school. Instead, 10,000 witnesses had seen the exact opposite. They'd seen a man spat on, attacked from behind, who beat his attacker in 9 seconds and then helped him to his feet. There was no case to make. There was nothing to point to. The papers the next morning didn't write about a dangerous foreigner. They wrote about the little instructor who put a giant on his back and then shook his hand. The men who wanted him gone had built the stage themselves, and Bruce had used it to become exactly the thing they couldn't touch. His school didn't close, it grew. People who'd been in that arena showed up at his door wanting to learn, not to fight, to learn what he really meant. The idea that the fight is won before the first blow, in how calm you can stay when a man is screaming in your face. Some of the students who came to him after that night stayed with him for the rest of his life. And Duke Halloran. This is the part people don't expect. Duke came to the school, not that week, a while later. He came in quiet, this huge man, and he stood in the back and he watched. And Bruce, who forgot nothing but held nothing either, let him stay. They were never friends, exactly. But Duke never said another ugly word about Bruce Lee again to anyone. Some men, when you beat them fair and then lift them up instead of grinding them down, something in them changes. Danny said Duke told a fellow at a bar once, years later, that the worst day of his life turned out to be the day somebody finally showed him mercy he didn't earn, and that it stuck with him longer than any beating ever could. Think back to how this started. A wad of spit on a young man's cheek, 10,000 people laughing, a giant looking down at a man half his size, sure, dead sure, that size was the only thing that mattered in this world. 9 seconds is all it took to prove him wrong. But the spit isn't really where it started, and the 9 seconds isn't really where it ended. It started years before in a small room, when a young man decided that the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm when everything in him wants to swing. And it ended, really, not with a giant on his back, but with an open hand reaching down to help that giant up. Bruce Lee spent the rest of his short life teaching that the goal was never to destroy the other man. It was to reach a point where you didn't have to, where you were so in control of yourself that another man's rage just spent itself against the air and fell down empty. He'd wipe the spit off his cheek, look at his hand and choose. Every time he'd choose. He didn't beat Duke Halloran with muscle. He never had the muscle. He beat him with the one thing Duke never trained a single day of his life. He beat him with the discipline to not throw a punch in anger and the strength to help his enemy stand back up. That's the story. A man spat in Bruce Lee's face before 10,000 fans. 9 seconds later, the giant was on his knees, and Bruce Lee was offering him a hand. And a little brown terrier named Bao was already licking the last of it off his face, while the whole arena chanted a name they'd come to laugh at. Some men carry a kind of power no amount of muscle can match. But you don't learn that from a wise old line at the start of a story. You learn it the way that crowd did. You learn it watching a small man put his hands behind his back and mean it. Thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. Take care of yourselves.